With my compositions, I am concerned with focusing on acoustic and psychoacoustic phenomena and the interaction between sound and architecture. And these pieces are not only concerned with how the listener perceives sound on a psychological level, but also how they perceive sound in a physiological level. But today, I'm going to talk about some research I've done on the perception of stasis, or what I term vertical time, within music. William James, who some might be familiar with, the pioneering American psychologist and philosopher, wrote in The Principles of Psychology, "Awareness of change is the condition on which our perception of time's flow depends." So that being said, if our perception of time is determined by the awareness of change, then if we can't determine the awareness of change, if you don't see things changing in front of you, then you may be, the sensation of suspended time might occur. Music theorist Jonathan D. Kramer refers to this feeling of suspension as vertical time. And he defines it as, quote, "a temporal continuum of the unchanging, in which there are no separate events and in which everything seems part of an eternal present." It's my opinion that there are certain compositional structures that can be used to situate the audience in this eternal present. These can include suppressing obvious temporal cues and making grand macro-level changes in form imperceptible. And it's within this time frame, when time seems suspended, that the listener has the ability to really focus on the subtle properties of sound. This level of concentration can create meditative states that result in heightened awareness of the self and the environment, along with increase in aesthetic and phenomenologic sensations. There are many compositions that achieve this state, but today I'm only going to talk about three, specifically Phil Niblock's A Trombone Piece, Eliane Radigue's Adnos 3, and my own piece titled Hummin'. But because of limitations of this talk and the fact that all these compositions are really long, they range from 20 to 70 minutes, I'm not going to be able to play a lot of them. If time permits, I'll play a little sample. But before I go into these pieces, I want to talk briefly on studies of consciousness and phenomenology in order to better understand these perceptions of time. Continuous, seemingly unchanging sounds, or drones, have long been used to aid in certain forms of meditation and are often used to guide religious experiences. Buddhist and Hindu mantras, among others, are usually sung in a monotone voice with very little variation of pitch. Such chants are used to create spiritual transformations and to aid in the pursuit of these experiences. Indian classical music similarly employs drones in a mystical and spiritual manner. The word Nada Brahma in Hindi is a word for drone that literally translates to God is sound, or sound is God. In many religious contexts, sustained, unchanging sounds are used to achieve a heightened state of consciousness. This is a picture of Pandit Pranath, who has passed, but he was a very influential Indian classical musician, specifically vocal, and who had a great influence on a lot of Western experimental musicians, such as Terry Riley and why am I forgetting his name? Lamont Young. Lamont Young. Similarly, in certain music therapy practice, therapists aim to induce states of trance through the use of pulsating or monochromatic sounds. Gongs, monochords, and singing bowls are often used. In all the aforementioned instances, sustained sounds of little variation, which create the sensation of an eternal present or vertical time, are used to produce altered states of consciousness. This is Dr. James Hopkins, who has these instruments specially built for him. He designs them and has an instrument builder build them. They're monochords, so all these notes are tuned to the same, all these strings are tuned to the same notes. This is the bottom side, and he flips it, and the person sits on top of it, and he strums it below. So I think it's safe to say that the perception of stasis, or vertical time, and sound is intrinsically tied to consciousness. But how do we define consciousness? One's personal consciousness is not a perfect mirror of reality, but it's rather a selectively filtered view of reality. In order to maintain our stable waking consciousness so it gets us through the day, our brain has to filter external reality, selecting only aspects of the environment that are deemed important. One obvious example is sound. If you take a recording of this room and listen back to it, you'll hear all the creaks in the walls, you'll hear all these things you're not paying attention to right now because you're listening to my voice. Microphones, unlike our voices, don't have filters. Microphones, unlike our brains, don't have filters. Aldous Huxley asserts that our brain, nervous system, and sense organs mainly function in an eliminative rather than productive fashion. He states, quote, "To make biological survival possible, mind at large has to be funneled through the reducing valve of the brain and nervous system. What comes out the other end is a measly trickle of the kind of consciousness which helps us stay alive on the surface of this specific planet. Although this filtering process is necessary for survival, it produces the negative side effect of people believing that this reduced awareness is the only awareness, and consequently regarding it as a complete picture of reality, when in actuality there are numerous other dimensions of consciousness that can exist within the same moment." William James wrote a very eloquent description of this in The Varieties of Religious Experience, which he quotes, "Our normal waking consciousness, rational consciousness as we call it, is but one special type of consciousness. Whilst all about it, partised by the flimsiest of screens, there lie the potential forms of consciousness quite different. We may go through life without suspecting their existence, but apply the requisite stimulus, and at a touch they are there in all their completeness. Definite types of mentality, which probably somewhere have their field of application and adaptation. No account of the universe in its totality can be final, which leaves these other forms of consciousness quite disregarded." While our normal waking consciousness may be the most practical mode for everyday existence, other forms of consciousness can be accessed through certain stimuli, the most obvious being meditation techniques, hypnosis, sleep deprivation, drugs, and music. As I previously noted, the concept of linear time is one of these aspects in our environment that keeps us going. However, since other forms of consciousness exist, then other forms of time must also exist. Time is not a fixed, unchanging element of existence. Our internal perception of time is just as valid as linear clock-driven time. The interval of 1 hour, as measured by a standard clock, may seem drastically shorter or longer to individuals depending upon their personal experience and what they're feeling at that moment. Time is therefore not an absolute reality, but rather a subjective experience. As Thomas Clifton explains in the displayed quote, "Time is not continuously flowing by us. It exists only through relationships between people and perceived events." The quote that you can read, "We are not spectators of time. We do not stand on time's banks and observe it flowing by us. Time has no grip on events. It is events as lived through by people, which define time." Since music is the construct of events, consisting of sound and or silences, it is listeners' relationship to these perceived events that defines musical time. It is true that all music takes up a certain amount of minutes or hours, but this moves in a linear fashion. But this time has nothing to do with the time that a composer means to evoke in a piece. It is the induced duration rather than the objective duration that lies in the phenomenal realm of music. A clock can tell us a certain amount of time that a composition takes, but this duration will tell us nothing about what the composer intended for it to take. While portraying linearity in their clock time duration, a composition can simultaneously express vertical time in its experience duration. I'd like to assert here that in order to exhibit vertical time, compositions don't need to lack an overriding linearity. All the pieces I'm going to show do have forms to them. There's an obvious beginning and an obvious end. The determining factor is not the absence of form, but rather the absence of perceived changes in form. I'll start with Phil Niblock. He began composing in the late 60s and is still active today. He creates works that perfectly exemplify this concept of perceived stasis in movement. The composer Gerard Pape described Niblock's work as, quote, "having always been and continuing to be, moving and becoming as one, moving in mobility." Many critics and musicians have suggested that his work creates the sensation of suspended time. But Niblock's music is not static at all. It's actually in constant flux. And when you listen to it, it feels like it's continually morphing and shifting about the space. He achieves this by exploiting frequency beating patterns, which are beating patterns that when you put two very close frequencies together, maybe about 1 to 5 hertz difference, you get amplitude modulation, and that creates beats. As the tones get further apart, those beats get faster. His pieces are usually composed for one acoustic instrument. So he has a piece for flute, a piece for oboe, for cello, for guitar, trombone. It continues because he's been doing it since the 60s. He chooses a musician to record and then asks them to play a sustained tone. So he'll have a trombonist play one note, and then he'll record that, and then he'll ask them to play 1 hertz difference. So he has to get incredibly skilled musicians to play these. Once all these notes are recorded, he then removes any breaks that occurred by either bow strokes or breathing, so that he has these blocks of sound. This is an example score of a piece called A Trombone Piece that was made in 1977. This consists of 3 octaves of A and slightly sharp A's. Within each octave, there are different frequencies that differentiate by only a few hertz. So if you can see, the time goes this way, and then you can see the blocks of sound in this direction. So you can see that 228 is paired with 220, 55 is the only one in that area. 110 is together, 220 is together. Basically, at any block of time, you'll see some that are very slightly different that overlap. I think 113 is paired with 110 and 115. So there are frequency beating patterns that occur in each octave here. And he additionally can get second order beats by combining detuned frequencies from different octaves. So if you have exactly an A in one octave and then an ever so sharp A in the other octave, you'll get second order beats between those 2 octaves. His decisions to place 2 or more frequencies together in time is not based on classical harmony. It's instead based on these resultant beating patterns. So in this way, all of his pieces, including this work, Phil Niblock strips away any conventional melody, harmony, or rhythm and just gets to the source, just to the sound. Although his pieces lack any conventional notions of rhythm, their creation and development is actually based on these rhythmic artifacts. His compositional decisions are guided by this phenomenon rather than traditional note chord progression. So in this sense, Niblock's process is actually founded in the vertical realm rather than in the linear realm. Instead of choosing frequencies based on how they unfold in a sequence, he chooses frequencies based on how they interact within a single moment. By removing all pauses for breath, he also eliminates any temporal markers and consequently obscures the passage of time. When listening to one of Niblock's pieces, the private subjective experience of time dominates the objective realm. I've had the experience many times of listening to his pieces and having no idea how much time had passed by the end. They range from 20 minutes to 70 minutes. Although his works can be described as a drone, which they always are described as that, when you're actually immersed in them, you start noticing all the movement of the rhythms and overtones. And while on the surface, if you first put it on, it seems static. As soon as you get maybe 10 minutes into it, who knows how long it is, your ears become adjusted to the sound and you realize that it's actually continually moving and all these beating patterns and rhythms are emerging. The next composer I'll talk about is Eliane Radigue, who is a French electronic music composer who began making music in the 1950s and is still active today. I would best describe her music as a narrative or journey that unfolds at an extremely slow pace. Okay, I'll go really quickly. Her pieces tend to be at least an hour long. She's composed pieces that are 6 hours long. And when you're listening to it, you'll think that it's not really changing, even if you're enjoying it. For the longest time, she only used the ARC 2500 modular synthesizer, which is pictured here, because she realized that she could do these very minute changes in filters and amplitude modulation and ring modulation that were almost imperceptible. But I've also had the experience of her work of thinking that nothing really changed throughout the piece, even though I greatly enjoyed it. But then you go back and you scroll in your iTunes at 10 minutes to 20 minutes to 60 minutes, and you'll notice that the sound is actually completely different. There's a very rhythmic section, there's a loud hissing section, there's an incredibly low drone. They change drastically. So she's able to achieve this by making these transformations happen over elongated time so that you don't know that they're actually occurring. A quote from her is, she says, "I could change the sound from the inside. To explain it visually, you can imagine a mountain turning into a cup, but so slowly from one state to another that it takes time by nature." So that's just a background of two composers and pieces that have greatly influenced me. Over the past few years, I have been exploring this idea of vertical time and stasis in two different areas, instrument building and composition. I've made a few instruments that are designed to produce sustained tones. This is a reimagination of a glass harmonica that Benjamin Franklin invented in 1761. In this version, 13 glass bowls of different diameters and pitches are stretched on this pole, and then you rotate it with a crank on the side. Another example are these two monochord instruments that I built in collaboration with Ben Bracken. They have 35 strings on them. 25 of them are a traditional monochord, they're all tuned to the same note. And 10 of them are also tuned to the same note, but they're on a tambura bridge, which is an Indian instrument. And the way the bridge acts is you pluck a string and it's actually very slightly tilted so that the string is going to hit that bridge at hundreds of times a second. So then you get all these overtones that emerge. And that's a close-up of the normal bridge next to the tambura bridge. My compositions use similar techniques as those employed by Radigue and Niblock in order to create a discontinuity between clock time and the private experience duration. Hummin', which was composed in 2012, exploits the acoustic and psychoacoustic phenomena that arise from microtonal tuning variations. This piece started because I had a harmonium, which is another Indian instrument that's basically like an accordion. It has metal reeds inside. And the specific one has 2 reeds per note, and it wasn't in tune with itself, which I liked because every time I played the note, I got these beating patterns from the reeds being out of tune. And from that, I also used a friend's harmonium that was also out of tune with itself and out of tune with my harmonium. So when they played together, you had got all these rhythms emerging. So that's how the piece began. And then I coupled those 2 harmoniums with 2 electric guitars, the hand-built glass harmonica that I showed, 4 aluminum rods, which are literally just aluminum rods that when you stroke it, it produces a very high-pitched noise, and electronics, which I used Max, which is a visual programming environment where you can create basically virtual instruments. And I used Max to, I basically made filters in Max, where I could isolate specific frequencies, and I chose the frequencies that were forming these beating patterns. I could then isolate and play back on top of the overall sound. So I'm basically like remixing the partials of the original sound. And the basis of this piece was to unveil the narrow space between closely paired tones. The 2 harmoniums serve as a foundation, and then all the other instruments kind of swoop in and out. The guitars were instructed to not only play slightly out of tune with each other, but out of tune with what they're hearing in the mass. So they add all these other beating patterns to it. The glasses I was processing live so that they also had beating patterns. In addition to all that, since the basis of the piece is to exploit beating patterns that arise from closely paired tones, I additionally implemented spatialization techniques. It was in quad, and basically each instrument was positioned diagonally. So one harmonium would be in speakers 1 and 3, another one would be in 2 and 4, and the same with the guitars. So basically, beating patterns emerge between speakers 1 and 2, 2 and 3, 3 and 4, and 4 and 1. Okay, I'll wrap it up. So while there is constant movement on many levels, the grand structure of the piece, the beatings between the speakers and the spatialization, the amplitude modulation on each sound, the movement is continuous and exhibits this non-directional floating quality to it. The lack of any temporal markers, such as a consistently identifiable rhythm, additionally obscures this passage of time. And the particular processing technique I was using of isolating frequencies and putting it back over top of the sound can be regarded, again, as thinking more in a vertical mass. In this approach, the actual instruments are cast away, and instead we focus on the subtle intricacies of the sound. One last thing about this. I am using loops in it, which I think of loops as symbolizing an eternal return to the present. So by constructing a massive sound out of these numerous 1-minute loops, I am in effect creating this constant return to the present. However, my loops, I put loop point variations, so it's never quite starting and stopping in the same point. So you never can quite discern that the loop is happening. And to end, I'd just like to end on a quote by Henry Bergson from An Introduction to Metaphysics, where he writes, to intellectualize the experience of duration is to falsify it. Real duration can only be experienced through intuition, as intuition reveals the frequently obscured reality of existence. Thank you.